Okay, welcome, Martin Sharp. It's great to have you here. We in 2022 face to face when I was in the UK. It just so happened to be the Queen's passing as well, so it was quite a memorable occasion all up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So welcome, Martin. You work at the Bank of England at the moment. You are an enterprise, a business, and a naval architect, which is quite a feat. So it's a real privilege having you join me today. And tell me a little bit more about you. So give us a little bit of your background. It's quite interesting architectural perspective, but I'd love to hear more.
I suppose it's, yes, when you sent me a few questions and I thought, okay, it's really made me think a little bit more about this. But I'm going to start going back really to really where everything started, as almost going back to as a child. This is where everything started from. I lived near the seaside and I was fascinated by boats. I have no idea why, but I just was. And really early on, I don't know whether I was 7 or 8. I remember going into the garage in the workshop and saying about, can I build a boat? And he said, yes. So he basically will just do it. And I thought, but I don't know how to. He said, no, get on and do it. So I got 3 blocks of wood of different sizes. I thought, there's the hull, there's a superstructure, and there's a funnel or something. And I nailed them together. And I spent ages painting them because I wanted it to look right. There was my model boat. And I thought, I'm going to try it. So I put it in the bath, and immediately it, as you'd expect, turned upside down. I thought, oh, that's not very good, is it? So what do I need to do? And I thought, okay, I'll put some weight underneath it. So in those days, you used to have lead around, not so much these days. And I nailed some lead underneath, and it almost was upright, but not. Then I put some more lead underneath, then it was upright. And really, that was I knew nothing about buoyancy at 7 years of age or any of the maths of anything else, but I was there trying. I wanted to build something. It didn't work. I kept on trying it. So I built a model to solve this problem, how to make it the vessel stand upright. Um, and that was the fascinating start of everything, I think. And that's been a bit of me throughout because I suppose I then moved on, obviously through schooling and everything, and I decided I'm going to become, and I discovered this term, a naval architect. And I was really impressed with the idea that there was a career in designing ships. I thought this is marvelous. So I went to university, studied to be a naval architect. And then having done that, I joined a shipyard. And I started by designing the heating system in a hovercraft. And I added in pipe work and just doing that. And I did that just on ordinary drawings and everything else. And then we introduced computer aided design and computer aided manufacturing. So that was in the early 80s. And I was asked to look after this. And I thought, great, I have no idea what it is. And I started then using computers to not just design a model that was a representation of my 3 bits of boat, but actually something that could be made. It was an accurate model. And that's where we started doing that. So we used it to design ships, which was great. And I'll come back to that when starting thinking about software and tools for modeling and all those sorts of exciting stuff as well. But I then, so we built that. That was great. Then I went on and just stepped up from a small vessel and modeled a nuclear submarine. So I was a first ever. They used to build a 1/10 scale model out of clear perspex to make sure everything fitted. And then we got involved and we built a complete 3-dimensional model of everything in it. But what was interesting here is I've always been interested in electrical things. Now, I said I put pipe work. I designed pipe work, but like cables, I thought cables, they're just like pipes, aren't they? They're just a bit flexible. And I thought, okay, in a submarine, you can't just put a cable in through the side because it's rings of steel. You can't do, you've got to thread it through. And some of these cables are the diameter of my arm. And it was a case of how, in the confined space, how heavy is it? Would a sailor or an installation engineer have the strength to manipulate it? And I started thinking about creating software to model weight, feeling. And that got me really starting to think. And that was quite a long time ago. I ended up writing software to help do design harnesses in cars and aircraft and so on. But that was the first time I'd started trying to model something to solve that real other problem. How am I going to fit something? So that's where I worked through that. I then moved into process design because I got in thinking processes, yes, processes, fluid flows, they're processes. But then we started getting into what are people going to do? Because a ship, a vessel, submarine, whatever it happens to be, is a contained something or other. It's constrained, it's got a boundary, it has a purpose, it has a clear objectives that are set by whoever wants that particular vessel. But importantly, it has a crew, it has people, it has an organization, and that organization has to use the cables and the engines and the structures and everything else, and they have to communications to make it all work. And this is in the back of my mind, I've always thought that's just like a business. That's where it started from, my thinking there. So when I started doing processes, I thought, how am I going to do processes? I want some software because I've always used software. Oh, it's something of some sort. And I came across an enterprise architecture modeling tool called Mega. It was a French software tool. It wasn't yet set up and available in the UK, but I'd heard about it. And I got the opportunity to make use of it in Airbus on the Airbus A380. So that was the first large aircraft there, and started using it in that space for some process work, process design. And that really was the first time I'd used a software tool to model an environment that wasn't purely physical. So it was the intangible pieces, the people. Yes, it was a straight organizational structure, but we started thinking about functionally, what is it that people want to do? So it wasn't just how we do it, but okay, what do they want to do? What do they want to achieve? And we started getting into that sort of thinking, and that got me really moving into that world of, oh, if I can do modeling here. I actually then joined Mega and set up, I was the first director of consulting in Mega, and we set up Mega and we employed consultants. So that's how I got really into that side, from delivering side to selling consulting tools and so on. But that was really quite exciting. That moved me forward. So that's really got me into the road of enterprise architecture and the tools that you need to create models. And going right back to my original point about my model Bolt, I built that to try and solve a problem. Okay, at the time I didn't know I had a problem, but I found one, and then I used it to help solve that complex problem. And that's where I suddenly thought, as I started working in telecoms, medical, government, actually, this is about creating a representation, a model of an organization so that people will understand it, because it's so complicated. And I thought, yes. So this was me. It was great. I was moving from a CAD CAM world, three-dimensional design and visualization, into modeling and representing a business and another architecture of a business. Great. So that's my sort of how I've moved from a child modeling boats through naval architecture into process design into selling consultancy around modeling tools into enterprise architecture.
It's not a leap in terms of the logic, right?
Right?
But in
Not at
terms
all.
of what people perceive, moving from that physical space into, I wouldn't call it digital, but it's almost like a virtual space. How would you describe that business space? Because it's quite easy to describe what let's say, a ship or an airplane is, or something that we tangibly understand. But how would you describe that to others? What a business is? What is that space to you?
Honestly, I don't see it as any different, with, I suppose, one exception, and that is it involves people who have feelings, they behave, you have some culture. The rest of it, like the hardware and software of applications, the physical buildings, all those sorts of things are no different from the real physical. What we're doing is adding in, just like I was trying to do in the submarine, of getting people, can I move this cable? is still there. How are these people going to interact? How are they going to make use of something? And that's the difference. That's the hardest bit of all. And I must admit,
Mm.
our modeling tools that we have available at the moment are just beginning to have a go at that sort of space. But that is the most important part. And why wouldn't we do that? I've never understood why nobody designs a car or a ship or a building or anything like that, or even a vacuum cleaner or a toaster without creating a model of it first. Is it going to
Mhm.
fit? Is it going to work? Why do we go ahead and spend millions of pounds reorganizing and designing a business and then think, oh, I wish I'd had a go at trying that differently. Could I try it first? Just logic
Mhm.
says, of course we should do, but why don't people? But that's what we're here to do. That's what enterprise architect, that overall enterprise architects, business architects, solution architects, business analysis, all these various disciplines are all about helping people solve a complex problem, reducing the risk of getting it wrong. And
Mhm.
it's the same thing. So why wouldn't we?
Mm. It makes perfect sense to me, and I hope to everyone else who's listening. But it does. It's a skill. Let me maybe expand it a little bit, what I mean by this. I've always said you can do a requirement, but a requirement can also be a design. And one of the things I've said for many years to learners, don't underestimate the value of a visual, because that's how we see ourselves. So for me, architecture is really about design. It's understanding the requirements and being able to design it in a way that is suitable for the use case, whatever that might be. So your analyst will really look at those requirements in a little bit more detail, but essentially architecture is about designing what that could be, as you were saying, building small models to test if this is what we agree on and this is what we're working on. So,
Yeah, and picking up on your point about requirement, I'm not sure necessarily we're clear about what the requirement is, what the real need is, because sometimes we need to produce something to help people understand what they really need. We know full well that if somebody's working in and they're in the depths of some detailed financial analysis and they're brilliant at doing that and they've got degrees, they're marvelous at doing that, why would you expect them to know about certain technological advances that would enable them to do their job more easily? They wouldn't know. Why would they not? So in lots of cases, there's groups of people that need to show people the art of the possible. And oh, you realize you could also do this. You're used to doing this, blah, blah, blah. But if you did it this way, or we use that could really help you. Oh, I didn't know I could do that. And therefore, people, and I really get uncomfortable sometimes saying relying on requirements as if that's the start point. Actually, that's not the start point. It really isn't. It's a way of articulating something in a way that other people can then develop further. And yes, they may change as people understand, but it's that real getting to grips and showing people and helping them. And that's where the modeling comes in to me. Showing
mm,
people, look, it could be like this, really, or creating a picture, and it could be a list of things. Let's not worry. That's not too worry about. It might be a very long list. Or I'll give you one example. I did some consulting with a company that fits tires. They're a major company in the UK that does tire fitting, and they were really struggling. They just felt their processes were difficult. There was things wrong, but they didn't know what was wrong. So I produced a diagram, and it's the most complex one I've ever done. It filled an A0 sheet, and I put on there every single process I could find in that organization, all the steps. It was unreadable.
mm,
Gave it to the MD and his technical director, and I said, so far, in the last week, this is what I've understood. This is what your business does. And he looked at me and said, I knew we had a problem. I really now understand it. We've got to fix that. So it was just helping them see we have a problem, sometimes because they don't realize it. Sometimes you have to produce these pictures to create a point to help people as oh, you could do it this way, you could do it that way.
I had a similar experience a couple of years ago. I worked with an enterprise architect, and we were busy doing a project, and we went straight to designing a wireframe based on what the learners, or not the learners, sorry, it's just a habit, what the end users were saying they needed, right? Went straight to and the project manager didn't like it, and everybody was, we shouldn't be doing this. Where's the requirements document that we need? And the enterprise architect got it. He said, this is exactly what we need. We just need them to tick it. And so, as to your point, that design, you don't always have to have that whole, you need requirements, obviously, especially when you get into the detail of what that design might be, but you don't always have to start with requirements. You can start with a prototype that you can work with in a model.
That's another thing about modeling, because there's different types of models, aren't there? And some of them are prototypes, right? So you try, it's not the complete thing, it's part of something. But you've also got to get people to understand that you don't necessarily, and this is a problem I often see in lots of places, that people are uncomfortable about locking. Okay, they don't want to hand their ideas over or their requirements over until they're absolutely sure they've finished them.
Perfect. Yeah.
Right. Now, I have an example of that when I used to work in the car industry, and we were working on in the engine bay, right? And the engineers were saying, look, we can't tell you where the exhaust pipe's going to go until we've finished detailing all the engine. And the people who looked after the body work, or the body in white, were saying, we need to know where it's going, because we have to do this. So is this like, we don't, so what we actually did, look, think about it. I'm from the people designing the body, they're not interested in where the spark plugs or the injectors go, but what they are interested in is the interface between the engine and where the brackets are needed for supporting the exhaust pipe, or the space that's needed, or the well for the gearbox. So then we start again to think about, we would actually just do a sort of a simple box that covers the shape, but define the interfaces and then manage those interfaces. So you can do anything you like inside your box. If you need to modify an interface, you've got to tell them, and vice versa. But that today, people won't pass information until it's finished. We've got to get past that. We've got to be working much more flexibly in that way, but you still need to find some of those. And that's where that again, coming back to that model and a sort of enterprise architecture model of the business, we're talking about some constraints here. So we have requirements, yeah, but we have constraints or fixed points, and we can define those in that same sort of way. Okay, this is what we definitely are going to be using this technology at this point in time. There's a fixed point, right? You don't need to worry about the details of how we're going to implement it, because someone else is doing that. You're going to make use of this. It's going to be a cloud solution only of this form. That's all you need to know about. Now work around, how do you want to use that? That's just some thoughts there about getting that flexibility, but sharing information with people as early as you can. And that's through that model. If you're doing it in there, you can look, you can see, you can try. That's the important part to me.
I definitely agree with you. The people talk about agile, but they often don't realize that being agile is being able to try things, and it's not just around the methodology of putting user stories on a sticky board. It's actually a way of thinking. And so what you've just described is that agility to be able to move things as discovery happens and as insight comes in. All right, that was really good. A little sideline chat from the question I was going to ask you next, which
so that was question one, wasn't it? Yes.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point of view, and I think it's really good for people to see beyond just requirements and really look at how design, I won't say design thinking, but thinking about design can really change the outcome of what needs to happen. I don't think many people truly understand that. So it's great to have you here. What are some of the key experiences or turning points that have shaped your career, Martin?
Okay, I've vaguely mentioned a
But
couple of things, but I'll come back and develop it further. I mentioned briefly about dealing with cables and doing some design work. We worked on took that a bit further and developed some software to help people work out where to put cable harnesses in vehicles. Okay. And I went out to Turin to the automotive conference and presented the idea. I was working at Land Rover at the time, still a very good company around. And myself and one of the guys from Land Rover presented this paper to the audience. We had so many questions, and the people themselves suddenly thought, you have solved with a piece of software a really difficult problem we've been struggling with. We have always found we couldn't get our harnesses right length. It wasn't this, that, and the other. You've solved a practical problem. And that was something that really struck me. And I've always remembered that as I did something and it solved people's problems. I thought, wow, my model did that for somebody else. So that was a really a turning point for me that says I'm doing the right sorts of things here. It can benefit others. Even if I don't understand what they do, what I'm doing provided that benefit, gave them some insights. So that was one interesting one. Another sort of strange one is I went to a conference about enterprise architecture. Oh, I don't know when this was. It's probably in the early 2000s. And what struck me in there was a lot of discussion about, they kind of call it technical architecture. Somebody mentioned the word business architecture because I think it was like the first year they put in TOGAF, they put the ADM up and it was the step B and it was business architecture and something. And I looked at that, okay, well, tell us a bit more about this. I thought, I don't know very much about that area as well. I thought, hang about, this is not very good. And I was actually at the time working at Cadbury's, still my favorite company and chocolate bar. But we went to Cadbury's and we were implementing an enterprise architecture using the Mega software again. We were doing this inside technology, and I kept on hearing the people I was working with trying to convince the business to be involved, saying you really should be doing this. But at the same time, they didn't ever regard their business colleagues as being their customers.
Mm.
And it was absolutely fascinating. They were on their own and they were saying, you over there need to do this. Look at the great stuff. We're doing lots of processes, but you need to do it. It was almost like, and that concept of them within technology, of them working with them to show them, to help them and thinking about that customer relationship and that link. And that's where it became very obvious to me that in those days, business modeling a business was not really done. And the OMG really hadn't got their heads around it. And I said, I'm determined because I'm that sort of person. I'm much more interested in the way people think, their motivations, how they feel, and how things are organized, and my work in process work, and the way I saw the automotive industry respond to harnesses. That same software has been used in almost all automotives. It's used in Xerox, it was used in the aerospace industry. So it was really started. So it really benefited so many people. And that's what I wanted to do more and more of. So it was really, that was a key thing that said, oh, there's a gap here and we need to develop it further. So that was a turning point, but it was a bit of a driver. And I can mention one other one, I think, if I may. I worked at a company called AAH Pharmaceuticals in the UK. They probably do as well at the moment, haven't looked recently, distribute medical products. So whether they be a syringe or a packet of tablets or whatever it happens to be, they distribute it to pharmacies. And I'm sure they do to loads and loads of other people as well. Now, there was a particular problem. I'd been doing some process work with them, and we were looking at getting process owners, which is the first company I've ever managed to achieve that in, which was brilliant. And we were going to set up a workshop because they were having some issue with the return of unused drugs from their pharmacists. So I thought, this is okay, this is going to be a difficult workshop because we've got to go through it. I've got all the top people there. We sat down and I said, okay, let's just work through what it is you do at the moment. And we started sketching things. I actually sketched in the tool live so we could make sure it fitted together, moved it around. And after about 10 minutes, literally over 10 minutes, the guy says, I know what the problem is. I said, what? And they said, let me just make a phone call. They went out of the room, came back in 10 minutes later or so, and said, we've just saved ourselves hours and hours of time. Thank you ever so much. That was it. And that's the quickest workshop I've ever been in. Cost them a fortune because I was there for the whole day. 10 minutes, they solved a problem. All we did was got them, and this is the act of them describing what they actually did. And they realized it was not what they had written down. From your experience in process work and capturing those, that people will often articulate and model a process and say, that's what it does. And you'll ask them, well, how long does it take? Oh, it takes it. And you've got the time it takes to do this, and the people involved in this. Okay. And then you go back to them and say, okay, overall, let's give the example of time. How long does this process take overall? I'll say X. Okay. So I'll add up all the little bits and pieces, which is Y. Why is X like 2 days longer than Y? And look at it again and say, oh, of course. If we issue that on a Friday evening, we miss that supplier and we have to wait till Monday. So that adds 2 days into the process. So why haven't you modeled that? Oh, that's not the ideal way, but that's reality. So people were modeling the ideal, not reality. And I always say it was almost like the interesting bit, and this is what was happening here. When we started modeling, we got them to think the exceptions and looking at that, and that was the exceptions were causing them the problems against their ideal process they thought everyone was following. And I think we're often in danger. I see that today. People model the ideal. I said, are you sure it's like that? And you push them and push them. No, it's not. We're the exceptions. Ah, yes, that doesn't often happen. Yeah, but doesn't that delay that? Or doesn't that take a lot more people? And they're the pieces that you need to look at. So that was a really fascinating situation. That to me, I've used that thinking many times. And it's really brought people up, think, yes, true. We don't create this just wonderful theoretical model. Let's think about it. Go back to my original design model, right? The metal had to be machined to the nearest thousandth of an inch, right? Okay, let's design the process and say, what actually happens? Now, it takes more time, and no way you're going to maintain those because regard that as a throwaway model. It was only needed for 10 minutes. They solved the problem. Great, off we went. So that was a real turning point again for me, and a real note of how that sort of thing can work very effectively and solve somebody's problems really quickly and easily.
I definitely agree. Getting people in projects to really design the current state, they often go, oh no, we already know what we're going to do. So we're just going to design the future state. And the challenge with designing just the future state is you don't know what the gaps are. So it's really hard to measure how you get from today to there. But they go, oh no, but we know what we're going to be doing. This is the proposed solution. Yeah.
But then you get some people who say, oh, we must do an as-is model. You start down, you talk about the as-is to create
The future.
the what I want to be.
Yeah.
And please don't, if you ever create an as-is model, then I can guarantee it's an as-was model. And who wants an as-was? It always is. So start that way, but the whole goal is in the back of your mind, you're trying to say what I want to create. And the only way you can do that is by talking about how do you do it today? What do you do? What do you need? What works? What doesn't work? Oh, we could, what about, oh, yeah, oh. And my point about you as someone who's facilitating that can say, are you aware that you might be able to do it like this? Really? You mean I don't have to copy and paste between two screens? No, you really don't need to do that anymore. Oh gosh, I hadn't thought about that. So yeah, I think you get the point there.
All right. So, in your own words, could you describe the importance and the role of business, enterprise, and modeling architecture in today's organizations?
Right. Okay, doke. Um, Obviously, you probably got the idea that everything from my very first creating of a model was all about a model of something that's very complex.
Mm.
And even I don't understand the complexity or how it all fits together and how it works, modeling it to try something new. How much lead do I put on the keel? That sort of thing. Trying things. That's where modeling a business is so important. Yeah, it's very difficult to do. I'm not saying this is an easy thing and it's wonderful and everything solves all the world's problems. It's not a silver bullet. But if you can begin to start thinking about your organization and some of the interactions and start thinking, I need to put it in somewhere, I need to represent that in a way, even that act of going from what is this thing I'm dealing with? Someone said to me yesterday, oh, we'd like to model an aspiration.
Okay.
Okay, so what is an aspiration? Because when you model
Mm.
something, it's got to be, you're going to connect in some way. An aspiration drives something, does it? What do you really mean? And when you go back, what do you really mean by that? Explain. And how's it different from a mission or a vision or a drive or all these other sorts of concepts? And people keep coming up with these new words. You've got you as the model, as the architect. Let's keep the two neatly together because in
Mm.
my mind, they're both the same things. You're interpreting and you're trying to also form things because, as we know, everything is connected to everything else in some way in a business. You turn off that piece of hardware, and suddenly in our case, our governor can't go and order his lunch. Well, how on earth was that? But oh, because there's something in the you hadn't realised the knock-on effect. So everything is connected in some way, and that's where those. And it's so complicated. Is it more complicated than a few million components in a nuclear submarine? Probably yes, because lots of those connections are temporary. A lot of those connections take place depending upon your dynamic staffing, the work that's going on in the moment, how they're feeling at home. All of these things affect their interactions and the way an organization works. So this is really hard to deal with, but that's to me why we need to start modeling businesses and the way people think as well, because it's getting harder and harder all the time to understand. And crucially, we are what we wouldn't want to do, I would suggest, is to create a design of an organization, just one. Let's say a brand new organizational structure with all the processes. We spent hours and hours modeling all this. Like we say, okay, let's implement it. And when we come to implement it, we realize that, oh dear, we've forgotten there's a whole group of people here who really are uncomfortable about this. They don't want to make this change. And there's good reasons for it that we weren't aware of because we're only seeing what we can see. Right. And you're not always able to see everybody who's involved in this. And it can be very disruptive. What we need to be able to try and do is to look at alternatives. So yes, I'm sure you're used to using conference room pilots, where you will have a group of people in the room role playing. What if we did this, that, and the other role playing processes? I love those. They are so good to do that. But that's where you need a tool like this, like any modeling tool, if we can get a decent one going somewhere, to help you do that, to trying alternatives. Now, maybe I'm talking about the future here in the next 10 years when I'm fully retired. I don't know. But we ought to have that vision. And that's what we need to be getting to. We can't afford the costly mistakes of making a change before we've had some element of testing. We've got to prototype. We've got to try alternatives. And it's much, much cheaper to try an alternative on a computer system than it is in a physical model, or sorry, a physical car or submarine or a physical business. Hiring and firing of staff. You don't want to be firing the wrong staff, do you? And you know how long
Mm.
it takes to hire people. So it's really difficult. So we need to test some of these things. What if we did fire this department? Let's try various options. What would it mean to us? Let's try and see whether we can model aspects of this. And oh, I wish we could get more sentient type feeling in our model somehow. I don't know how we're going to do that, but that's the direction we need to get into, because that is the ethos behind a whole business: interaction, the way people behave. So I know I'm extending enterprise architecture into a whole different world, but hopefully there's people out there who are all trying to do that at the moment. But that's where I think that's why it's so crucial to do this, and we need to keep pushing people to think this way. I spoke earlier, I mentioned the word digital twin,
Yeah.
and I mean, I looked at that and I saw a good presentation, and I'm used to digital twins because that's what I've done for years. And I thought, actually, why can't we do that with a business? Why wouldn't we? Okay, it's very hard. F1 racing or Tesla cars, they will take live feedbacks from all the vehicles out on the road or on the test track. F1 racing is a classic. They measure something on the car, analyze it, and then adjust something on the car so it performs better. There's your proper digital twin. Why couldn't we start moving in that direction? I'm not talking about electronic feedback. I'm talking about that feeling testing. There's an element of that to build into what we do. That's where we need to really focus on to move in that. So we're trying to introduce here into the bank actually the concept using the words digital twin as
Mm.
opposed to a repository or a model, because when I talk about a model in a bank, that's a financial model as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
So to try and use the right words and choosing something different, people think, oh, what do you mean by that? And you explain it, oh, I see what you mean. So
Do
that's the sort
you
of
when you use a digital twin, just so I can understand
mhm.
in the bank context, would that mean mimicking every interaction that is occurring in, or
Oh,
is it the
if,
role?
oh, if only. No, you can't. No,
Yeah.
it's really getting people to think there's going to be, you're going to have to take thin slices of areas and you're going to have to really work. It's no, we're very early days of being able to do that sort of
Yeah.
thing. But we've got to have that goal. That's the objective. That's what we're trying to get to,
Mm.
right? And the thought of having to model and create a model and keep it up to date of every single thing in
Yeah.
that's going on in an organization. No, you have to in something that's physical, because you've got maintenance and warranty and safety and lots of things, and there's a lot more money involved in doing some of those sorts of things, and the costs are much higher. But in a business, actually, maybe we should as well.
Mm.
The costs are even higher if you get it wrong. Maybe NASA do all the space. I don't know. Well, what about just ordinary businesses? Why wouldn't we?
And you mentioned at AI, and we look at
Hmm, hmm.
truly understanding what people are going through, understanding the context and the environments, and having the right conversations, which is the hard part in
Hmm,
business,
hmm.
right? How would, because AI can give you information, right? It can come up with great ideas, it can do all of these kind of things, but how do you think that, how realistic is that considering the nature of business? So, what is the role that would play?
What we have available to us now within AI and enterprise architecture, I mean, a few tools have got it, is that you can teach your meta model. You can teach it the things that are there and the connections. So it understands some connectivity. And therefore, when you ask it the questions, the old querying of things is a thing of the past now. You ask it the normal question and it will understanding connections and bring things out. But of course, that all depends upon, and of course, it can do it with just in your digital twin, or then you can extend it out into more information in your organization, or if you dare to extend it out further as well. So it depends on how you structure things. But that depends upon what you put in your model.
Yeah.
And do you have some of these softer elements? Are we
Mm.
able to show some of these things? So yeah, practically we can say does our governor, if we turn that piece of equipment off, will he be able to order his lunch? There's a question I could ask. Tell me, if we turn that one off, no, he can't, because it can follow the trade. human mind can't think all that way through. So it can do those simple things, provided we have the information there. So we're then looking at, we are going to need like a team of people to look after things. And there's going to be a balancing act here. How much do you do? How much don't you do? And I'm just really hoping some tool vendors will begin to start helping us a bit more in that space. So we've got to get to that point.
It's a very interesting space. And I've shifted it into this question prematurely between what do you see in the next 5 to 10 years, and specifically, how would you incorporate AI in the architecture toolbox? What do you see? And I don't see AI becoming sentient. My personal experience with it, it may speak nicely and stuff, but it doesn't feel like it actually has any kind of feelings. But again, who knows what's going to happen in the next 5 years?
But it may not. I'm not expecting to have feelings, but if we can model, like I was trying to model with those original cables, how heavy it is, how difficult it is, if we can begin to work out how human interactions can be represented in a way, modeled in a useful way. So when you're modeling anything, the first thing you do, you look at it and you try and say, I'm not going to create a perfect replica of it, unless you particularly want to, but it's normally saying, what are the characteristics of this and how can I represent that in a system to help me solve this particular problem? When you're looking at changes that an organization wishes to make, those changes, whether it be through projects or whether it happens to be whatever approach you take, there's going to be an element, it's going to have an impact upon people. So how do you determine what that impact is? And you're going to think impact. Any change, a simple change might be, oh, I've got to train some people. So there's formal training bits and pieces. But if you introduce something, if you announce, for example, in an organization, you've tried lots of different things in your modeling. So actually, I'm going to announce some form of reorganization. I said, we don't know it all yet, but here's the top level for you. As soon as you announce that, I've always asked them, how much time, non-normal working day, BAU type time, is going to be spent by individuals talking about it?
Yeah.
And that is one of the impacts of any change we make. And it's a very thing, we can measure that. If we could identify that, we could say, look, it's going to have that. And when we introduce something, we said we might do something. And there were lots of meetings, lots of discussions, and now we might not. But before the introduction of announcing we might, nobody sat down and thought, well, what disruptive impact is this going to have upon our people? Just by sometimes you share things, you've got to understand that impact upon people with the changes. And time is one aspect, extra time it takes out of people's normal working day. And then if you've got that one project you're promoting, that one architectural change you're making, overall architectural change, that's one. Then you add another one. How many, even in your organization, changes are going on at the same time? We've got hundreds going on. And if you add them, how many of them impact that individual? And I don't know where I feel like I'm a ratchet, right? My sort of stress levels go up a bit, and then up a little bit more. And the next one, I can cope with each of them, that's fine. And you reach a point, you say, no more, please. We talked about change saturation. You reach that point, we say, no more. And it's like, where do we really look at that in business? We were doing some work with one of the building societies in the UK about that whole aspect, and they were trying to look to see what type of changes, how that affects people in different ways. So if it's a change which affects everybody in an organization, but it's a bit like we've just had a new timesheet system rolled out. Okay, it looks almost exactly the same as the old one. How long have I spent looking at it? Probably I took 2 minutes longer than I would normally the first time. End up right. Okay, there's a real, everyone is impacted, but the impact is very small. Okay, you get another situation where the impact may be just as a few people are impacted in the organization, but it's major. And that takes a lot of effort. How do we determine that? Types of changes, is it impact upon people's morale? Is it their performance? So looking at these things, and what the Building Society tried to do was to historically start looking back and capturing this type of project impacted people like this. Okay, this one impacted people like this. Okay, is there a characteristic of the type of change that impacts people in a certain way? Is there any relationship between the, i.e., can we model a type of change against the impact upon people? If we can start doing that, we could begin to say, when we do our overall strategic type planning, which is obviously the start point of any architecture work, and it's all linked in with it together, is actually we probably should slow down this existing change to allow this one to take place, because there's this group of people just won't cope with it altogether. Whoever does that? Now, those are the future areas that I think that if we can find ways of representing these interactions and these feelings, these behaviors, and these, I've said change impact might be time, might be something else. I'm not a psychologist. There are other things going on, other things we can use to represent that aspect. Don't know. Question to everybody. How can we do that? That's the direction I think
Yeah.
we need to get into.
It's really interesting because years ago I read a book called Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard. And one of the key learnings that I got out of that was he said that often what is perceived as resistance to change is usually just a result of fatigue. And I was thinking, there's lots coming in, and there's going to be a lot coming in now with AI. That's the reality, and how quickly people will embrace it will impact huge organizations and so forth. But you do get saturated with technology. I do, and I'm a complete geek. I love technology, but I'm not on all social media networks because I was like, I'm not going to choose 100. I'm just going to choose 4 or whatever it might be. And then someone said, "Oh, but you really need to be on WhatsApp." And I just I was in a complete mental block with going, I've decided I'm not going to use that application. And I think it would have helped me when I travel to be able to call phone numbers without paying extravagant fees. But I can understand that a lot of people might feel that level of fatigue and just saturation with all the, especially the digital changes that are occurring, because it's not as if it happens once in a blue moon. It happens often in businesses. It's all the time, and
It's
there's
all the
not going
time. And we need to do, we had an interesting session on resilience. We try and do a lot of understanding about well-being and mental health and so on. And I know this is not part of enterprise architecture, but I just wonder whether this is the area we need to be really somehow recognizing a bit more, because everything is very mechanistic. This application, you press that button, it does that. But what's the thought process? How does that make people feel? Are they responding right? I think that to me, over the next 5 to 10 years, that triggered by AI, because AI is going to enable us to not worry about asking very complex questions of a lot of related pieces of data and getting ideas. Our problem is going to come of trying to model these soft feelings, these interactions, which are the heart of a business. How many times in your discussions have you heard the word, "Oh, we want to change the culture of this organization because the culture's not"? What do you mean? And so this word is getting more and more used, and it is right. It is the thing. Just think, as we moved, through COVID into virtual working, into hybrid working, the whole way we interact is different now. I wouldn't know how to model that, but we need people now to start thinking about that, because that's all our lives. That's the way it is. That's the next big step for me. I won't be for me, but that's the big step I'd like to see happen.
Yeah, it's really an interesting environment. I find it's fascinating. It's like when the internet really became a thing in the public. There was lots of curiosity and playing and figuring stuff out. And now I think we in a similar space at the moment. All right, second to last question.
Yep.
Could you share some advice or lessons learned for professionals entering or growing their careers in business or enterprise architecture or just modeling architecture? What advice could you share?
Okay. There's a mixture of skills, advice, a whole range of things here as well that coming into this one. I think there's an element here of, to create a business model, you always have to remember, in the environment we're in, it's always going to be a representation of reality.
Mm.
It's not like the physical model of the ship, the submarine. So representation, and we're going to have to, so there's a real key skill in looking at something. And I was traveling back in the train yesterday and I'm thinking, okay, that seat in front of me, I could create a model of that seat with all its plush furnishing and its armrests and its bits and pieces. I could do all that, wonderful. But actually, why would I want to create a model of that? Well, actually, I want to determine how long I could expect someone to sit in that comfortably. Okay. So I'm thinking about the comfort. Right. Okay. So I need to model some angles. I don't need to model the supports under the seat and everything. So I'm then interpreting. So I'm going to now interpret. I'm going to model that to help me solve that problem.
Mm.
And it's
That's
always
fascinating,
that way.
actually.
That's a
It's
real
not
skill.
it's not looking at the object. It's so if I'm understanding you, you're not looking at the object. You're looking at the use of the object as the way in which to model. Is that?
The use, yes, yes, it's partly the use. It's more, okay, why was I looking at that seat? Okay, there is a problem, and maybe this goes back to drivers for change. So
Mm,
maybe I've had a number of reports and complaints about the long journeys and a lot of people getting back problems. Okay,
mm,
so I need to start looking at that. And then at some point I look and come back, obviously sitting down. Okay, the problem is something to do with people complaining about lack of comfort in some way. Okay, I want to look at the interaction between that person or a person and that seat and determine, how do I represent both of them in the right sort of way. So looking at, I had an MRI recently of my neck and looking at the shape of my neck, because I find when I travel, the headrests on trains are never in the right place, right? And
especially
I
if
don't,
you're short like me. If you're 5'1", you will
yeah,
never find a headrest
well,
that
exactly.
fits you.
And I'm only, what, 5'10" or something, and they don't suit me at all. I don't know if they suit anybody. So it's a bit like, oh, God. So it's those sorts of things. You say, look, if they're the problems, I need
Mm,
to create a model to help me understand much more clearly what really is the essence. It's almost like the root cause analysis,
mm,
but I'm using a model and then interpreting the physical, or in business sense, the interactions and some of the systems and bits and pieces. Well, how are they working? How can I model that?
It's interesting because it links really well to this user stories. And I know we talk about user journey mapping and various, but user stories specifically, because there's that instant of where you're using something and why you're using something. So it's a really good insight. And I hope people realize that it's quite different from just the functional. It's almost like that you have to look at that non-functional environment far more deeply. I'm talking about the seat as
Yeah,
being a short woman.
yeah, yeah,
I struggle with a lot of things. And if you get a tall builder to design your kitchen, then you're really in trouble
yeah,
because he
yeah.
designs it for his
Well,
height, right?
on that point, that's an interesting point, because this is where we have standards, don't we?
Mm.
And we have our architectural standards, and we have our building standards and our planning standards. And that is to be able to define. And for us, I would see in any organization, you need to start developing what are those standards that so that you'd have to retest it every time. So that you don't get the, oh, right, the tall person, short, but where happens to be you, and that is very relevant for the work environment. I mean, don't forget, in an organisation, people sit at desks and stand at desks and a whole range of other things, and some people get very distracted with noise.
Mm.
I'm one of those people who find it very difficult to concentrate when I'm hearing lots of other stuff, right? But at the
With
same
you there.
time, I don't like headphones on both ears because I like to hear what's
Mhm.
going on because that's how you pick up the snippets of bits of in there, the interaction. But it's different environments because I remember working at one government body where we were beginning to look at and they started zoning the areas of the office because they had a large number of people who were quite high on the autism spectrum.
Mm.
The best scientists in the world are very high on the autism spectrum. That just goes without saying, right? They're the greatest, but they're the people who like change least.
Mm.
Now, when I was working at Public Health England, we were trying to look at and see how we can understand that aspect. So that's part of behaviours. That's
Mm.
part of looking at change, communicating it, and again, a part of looking at the whole way an organisation is architected, put together. How do we ensure that we don't upset that group there and not that group over there and so on? So you're beginning to look at some of these dynamics based around people, groups of people, and it may be different personas is a way of doing it. That's a way of modeling things. That's part of that. It's not the only element, but because user stories need to go a lot beyond. But
Further.
that's, yeah. So there's a couple of skills. Now, I for modelers, if you want the skill and looking out for modelers, you've got to look back to people, someone who's always modeled, who's
Mm.
they make models. Because if they're not made models, why would it's that's what I go back to. So in general, I think there's a couple of characteristics of or people or careers you will have seen, which I always say is a great source of modelers, and that's engineers. Someone who's done any form of engineering, because they are taught to solve problems, and they will use mathematical models, computer models, physical models, business models to help them solve problems, and they're taught to do that. Any sort of engineer, civil, aeronautical, marine, hey, up the marine engineers. And the other group of people are artists,
Mm.
very good at looking at something. Think back to my train seat. They look at something and they can understand it and they can put it down in whether it's a flat medium or whether they carve something. And they take the essence of that. It's not quite solving a problem, but it's taking the essence of whatever they're seeing and putting it so that's what it means to me.
Mm.
So some really great characteristics to look out for if you're looking for people. And to me, that's my start point for any form of architect, someone who thinks. So when I'm interviewing anyone, if I see that on their CV, I think, oh, that's good. I know they can solve problems. And that's my start point. It really is.
Mm.
There's a lot more to that. And there's lots of great people who've
Mm.
never been engineers or artists or what have you. But that's
Mm.
what I've noticed. But I suppose that's
Mm.
because I am an
Mm.
engineer.
Mm. That's really good insight because this whole conversation has been good. I think the good thing about it is maybe just changing the perspective a little bit from what we do more to how we do it and why we're doing it in a specific way. So,
Mhm.
last question for you. If you could go back in time, Martin, to a young Martin,
Mhm, mhm.
or younger Martin, should I say, and give yourself a piece of advice. And I do love your childhood story. But let's say you're entering into the career, what at the time was naval architect, but knowing what you know today, what advice would you give yourself?
It's interesting, this one, and I've thought quite a lot about this one. This is the toughest one of all, because the
Mhm.
implication from the question to me was that if I'd given myself some advice, I'd have done something differently.
Mm,
I wouldn't.
mm,
So there isn't any advice that I think I would have given myself that would have not that would have I would have done things slightly differently in a different order, but in some way in my career have gone almost like full circle. Started by
yeah.
modeling a boat, and I've ended up modeling a business. Right. So
Mm,
I've ended up modeling it because I'm in the middle. But there's a piece of advice that I don't know where I heard it, or whether I invented it. Let's assume I heard it somewhere, that I've always followed. And I suppose this is almost like the same sort of thing. It's, you mentioned the journey word, but I think of my life has always been like, I'm walking down a corridor. Okay. Nice big bright light at the end. That's fine. Lots of doors off the corridor. All the doors are shut. As I go down that corridor, um, those doors won't open for me. Nobody's going to open that door. I've got to push on the door. And if I push and I find it's locked, okay, that's not for me at the moment. If I push on one and it opens really easily, yeah, okay, I might go through that. If I push on it, it's quite hard to push on it. I've got to put real effort. Yeah, that's the one I need to go for. So it takes effort. The reward through that one is greater. So it's always a case of keep pushing, keep trying the different doors. You just think of my career has started with a naval architect. I then came immediately a marine engineer. Then I became a computer-aided design consultant, then a process engineer. Then what was I? Was just generally I used to salesman. Yep, just software salesman. And then I was a trainer in process modeling. And then I became an enterprise architect. And then I thought, oh, I fancy being a business architect as well, because that was needed. And then I've gone back to enterprise architecture because that's needed. And I'm now back to modeling again. So I'm now trying to make the best use of a tool because, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've semi-retired now. I only do 2 days a week. So what can I do in 2 days? So I can't do the same thing I did before. So now I'm focusing on equipping people to be able to model, to represent, to understand what's going on in their organization. But I mean, it's that little advice I have always lived by, that push on the corridor, push on the doors, keep moving forward. It's that pushing, to me, is pushing on the boundaries of modeling. You keep pushing. I want this feeling. Well, come on, you software people out there. How are you going to help me do that? What are we going to do? And in the modeling, so there's one piece I always say at the beginning of the little training I do in any what I do. It's like, only produce a drawing or a model if it's to solve a problem and you know who it's for.
mm,
Because knowing who it's for will help you define the way that you communicate to them, whether it's in a big, flashy, beautiful, wonderful picture or it's a detailed database model, whatever it is. They may both be solving problems, but make sure you know who your audience is. And the whole thing about a problem is never produce a drawing for the sake of producing a drawing. Okay, we did some business model canvases. Great. They served a purpose. Wonderful. Great. Not to do anymore. Why would I do another one? I didn't do one in that area. What doesn't need it? So don't just
mm,
keep doing it for the
mm,
sake of doing it. So must solve a problem and must be for someone. So never model for the sake of it.
mm.
There are a couple of things there.
Yeah, it's been an amazing conversation. Thanks, Martin. I really think a lot of people will find some real insights. You mentioned about how you see walls and doors. I've I've been the same. I always say I just see doors. But when I spoke to somebody else previously, what do you mean doors? I don't think everyone sees life the same way.
No, no,
I was
no.
surprised at that point. So it was good that doors, and play with it and have a look and see what might be possible, the art of the possible into the future. Mm.
That's right. Absolutely. And I want to push the boundaries. And I'd like, interesting, this might be might want to not include this one piece if you wanted to, but When we first started going back to the shipbuilding and computer-aided design, we didn't have the software available to us to design everything we needed into a ship. So what happened in the UK is that all the naval shipyards got together and all the merchant shipyards got together. The naval shipyards chose one vendor for a modeling tool. The merchant shipyards chose another vendor. And it was agreed, there was a collaboration. And all the shipyards said, we will work with you. We will work with you and define our requirements because you don't know how to draw scantlings. You don't know how to put seals in between engines and compartments. We know how to do that. We'll show you how to do that in return for you creating the software to help us do that. Now, we're in a situation, aren't we, where we have dozens of EA modeling vendors out there. Lots of little ones, and each of them have got a few customers. But no one organization is going to invest in meeting a lot of needs. There has to be a change in mindset between a larger group of customers coming together and saying, for better or for worse, we will work together. We're not in competition because modeling is a technique and so on. We'll pool our resources. We'll buy from the vendor. It might be a couple, wherever they want to get together, 2 or 3 together, and they will deliver what we need. And wouldn't that be a step forward? I wonder whether they'd ever do that. It worked before.
I wonder, yes.
I wonder. There you are. There's a call. Who's going to step up to that plate?
All right, Martin, that's a great challenge to put up there. I'd love to see you would step up to that. In closing, how can people get in touch with you? What is the best way if they've found this insightful? Do you have a blog or a
No, I
Facebook?
don't. No, I haven't. No, I don't have a blog. I'm busy dealing with grandchildren. I'm busy learning how to be a beekeeper. I'm so busy doing other things as well. Yes. If people want to get in touch with me, I think it's probably as easy to get in touch with me directly. I'll do, Deirdre. It's probably best thinking about this, probably best if they use my personal email. Right. The reason is that, how long until I fully retire from the bank? I have no idea. I think it's best to separate some of these things sometimes. So I think it's my personal email is probably the best one to use, and that's absolutely fine. Quite happy to share that one, which you already have. So
yes, that's great. Thank you, Martin. I'm going to end the episode now. We've covered quite a bit. I think it's been wonderful having you, and thank you for spending your evening chatting with me. So I really do appreciate it.
My pleasure, and I'd like to see it called Blueprints because the first ever drawing I saw in the shipyard was literally a blue piece of paper with dark blue lines on it, a true blueprint.
I like the word blueprints for architecture, obviously for that very reason, but I thought it would make sense that we create these lessons and learnings from the different types of blueprints. How do we get one in the end? I'm not sure, but
Yes,
all right, I'm gonna stop.
My pleasure.